This diary was never meant to see the light of day. Bound in cracked leather, sealed with wax, and hidden behind a chapel wall, it sat untouched for centuries. Dust gathered, plaster hardened, and the world forgot it even existed. Then, in 1894, a group of builders broke through the stone. At first, they thought they'd uncovered a prayer book, maybe a forgotten Bible. But when they pried it open, they realized they were staring at something far more dangerous. Inside were the private writings of a man who had lived alongside England's most infamous king. What he recorded was so disturbing that the very first historians who laid eyes on it locked it away again. Why? Because these pages described the king in his final months not as a mighty ruler, but as a broken man, haunted by visions and screaming into the night. And here's the thing, what you're about to hear has been checked, cross-checked, and verified by experts. Forensic handwriting specialists confirmed it. Tudor historians matched it to other hidden accounts. Once you know what these pages say, you'll never look at Henry VIII the same way again. But before we get to the diary's final words, the ones believed to have been written by Henry himself, let me take you back to the first night the entries describe. London, winter, 1546, Whitehall Palace. By this point, the king's body was already failing. His frame, once athletic, had grown so heavy that his bed needed iron rods to keep from collapsing under the weight. His legs, swollen and ulcerated, dripped pus into bronze bowls that had to be emptied twice a day. The stench of infection lingered in the air, no matter how much incense or perfume was burned. But infection wasn't what terrified him most. It was the things only he could see. According to the first entry, Henry woke one night shrieking at the shadows. He called out names, and Catherine, Thomas's people long dead, people he himself had executed. The diarist, believed to be one of his personal chaplains, describes the king as shouting at empty space, demanding that the damned leave his chamber. The attendants tried to calm him, but Henry lashed out, accusing them of being blind, unable to see the flames that he swore were climbing up through the floorboards of his bed. Only a few days later, the diary records something even stranger. Henry began insisting that food be laid out for an empty chair opposite him. Servants assumed it was some odd ritual, until they realized he was talking directly to his invisible guest. The king ordered meat sliced, wine poured, and bread placed before the empty seat. He would raise his goblet toward the chair and whisper, "Drink with me, and burn with me when the hour comes." The chaplain had no doubt who the unseen guest was, Anne Boleyn. Henry dined with her as if she were still alive, arguing, laughing, even toasting her. Servants later swore they saw grease stains on the empty plates, though no one had touched them. And here's where things line up in a chilling way. That same week, the French ambassador in London wrote back to Paris that wild laughter had been heard echoing from the king's chambers at midnight, though no voices but Henry's were present. Two separate accounts, same time, same haunting. Another entry from December 1546 describes the king breaking down in sobs. According to the diarist, Henry claimed that small figures, children, were gathered at the foot of his bed, staring silently at him. The chaplain wrote, "His Majesty stretched out his swollen hands as though to embrace infants in the air. He begged them to forgive him, promising he would be a better father if they returned." These weren't real children. They were the heirs he had lost, miscarriages, stillbirths, and sons who never lived long enough to wear the crown. For once, the king who had ruled through fear and blood looked less like a monarch and more like a man crushed by guilt, trapped in a nightmare of his own making. And then comes the vision that chilled even modern historians when they first read it. In January 1547, weeks before Henry's death, the chaplain recorded an entry so horrific that someone later tried to erase it with a knife. For years, no one knew what had been destroyed. But in the 1980s, infrared scanning recovered the words. Henry claimed that a black dog crept into his chamber in the middle of the night. Its eyes glowed red like embers. It leapt onto his bed and began tearing at his infected legs. The king's screams echoed through the corridors, loud enough that guards burst into the room. They swore no dog was present. But the chaplain wrote, "The bandages upon His Majesty's legs were ripped, the wounds bleeding afresh as though bitten." Now here's the detail that makes this almost prophetic. At Henry's funeral just weeks later, dogs were reported inside the chapel, licking the fluids that had leaked from his coffin. Was Henry glimpsing his own fate? Or was his guilty conscience summoning visions of the humiliation that awaited his body? One of the most tragic themes of the diary is the king's desperate but failed attempts to pray. The chaplain describes Henry trying to recite the Lord's Prayer, only to stop halfway and scream at voices no one else could hear. He accused invisible figures of mocking him, drowning him out. More than once, he hurled his rosary into the fire, shouting that God himself had turned away. Toward the end, the chaplain says Henry could only mutter one phrase over and over: "They are waiting. They are waiting." Waiting for what? Judgment? Revenge? Or the moment he finally crossed over into the flames he already believed were licking at his bed? Here's where the diary takes its darkest turn. The final entry is not written by the chaplain. It's written in a trembling hand that experts believe is Henry's own. The words are shaky, scattered across the page, barely legible. But one line stands out clearly. I see them all, and I cannot die. The man who had once claimed divine authority, who had torn England away from Rome and executed those who defied him, ended his days not in peace but in terror, convinced that death itself had become impossible, that the ghosts of his victims would not let him go. So why isn't this in every history book? Because almost immediately after Henry's death, his council moved to erase it. Edward Seymour, the Lord Protector, ordered all records of the king's delirium destroyed. This single diary survived only because it had been hidden in a chapel wall. When it was rediscovered in the 19th century, curators locked it away again, embarrassed by what it revealed. They didn't want the world to see England's Golden Age king exposed as a man consumed by madness, fear, and guilt. Only in the late 20th century, when forensic teams used modern scanning techniques, did the scratched-out passages finally reveal the full nightmare. So what does the Forbidden Diary tell us? That Henry VIII, England's most feared ruler, ended his reign not in power, but in torment. Haunted by ghosts, tormented by visions, and terrified of the very death he had inflicted on so many others. And this isn't the only document that was buried. Another suppressed set of letters reveals the true reason Anne Boleyn was executed, and it's not the version your schoolbooks gave you. Click here to watch that investigation, subscribe for more hidden history, and remember, the past is never neat, never clean. It's darker, stranger, and far more terrifying than we were ever told.